Hello, welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. My name is Dr. Leslie Ellistad, and I will be the host for tonight. I'm part of the committee of the Wellness Through Mindfulness group and one of the teachers. If you haven't been to one of our events before, this group is a local Calgary group that sponsors these evenings where we bring talks and teachings on mindfulness. If you've attended our events before, welcome back. We are very happy to be continuing to work with Maya and the Calgary Public Library team and appreciate this mutually beneficial relationship with them. Our bi-monthly event started over 5 years ago at the Shaganappi Community Center, and we have always sourced our presenters from the local community of meditation teachers and practitioners. And we continue to do that as we've been working with the Calgary Public Library. If you're interested in learning more about our group, you can look on the website for our group, which is wtmthebreathproject.org, and that will be posted in the chat box. We have guided meditations on there and recordings of our talks and some written material as well, and some references to other resources on mindfulness that you might find interesting. So before we get to tonight's speaker, I would like to let you know what's coming after tonight. On January 6th, Christine Francoeur sends her regrets. She's unable to speak that evening. Instead, I will be speaking on the topic of mindfulness for meeting 2022 with clarity and calm confidence. And Christine will present her topic later in the year when she's able. And then on January 20th, Jeannie Corrigal from Saskatoon, she's a mindfulness teacher in Saskatoon, will be speaking on mindfulness of joy and other wholesome states. And then on February 3rd, Stacey Madden, who's from Calgary, teaches somatic wellness. So her topic is called Embodied Resilience, a body-centered approach to well-being. So we have a lot to offer you coming up in the new year. Look forward to seeing you then. Tonight, we're very happy to have Anne Mahoney returning. Dr. Anne Mahoney is going to present on viewing the pandemic through the lens of the Buddhist teaching. Dr. Mahoney is very well known here in Calgary in the mindfulness community. She has been one of the major people to share mindfulness teachings and in many different ways. I'll get to that in a moment, but first of all, primarily she is a psychologist, a clinical psychologist in private practice, and she's let us know that she focuses her work on trauma with both individuals, couples, and groups. And she also helps her clients understand the effect of their family of origin histories and helps them to find a way to work with all of this and function as best as possible in their current life. Her clinical approach includes integrating mindfulness, equine facilitated wellness therapy, and trauma-related exercises where appropriate, along with traditional psychotherapy. Anne has studied and practiced in the Vipassana tradition, the mindfulness meditation tradition, for 35 years. And she studied with Ayakima and Bhante Gujaratna and other North American trained teachers. Those two teachers were trained in the East. Anne has been teaching for 19 years in this tradition. She leads a bi-weekly meditation group and a bi-weekly Dharma study group. She also leads meditation retreats, both online and in person when that's possible. And she is here tonight very generously to share her understanding of the Four Noble Truths with us and how to apply this to COVID. So welcome very much, Anne, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Leslie, for that lovely introduction, and welcome everybody. It's nice that you've joined the program this evening. We are going to start this evening by doing a meditation, and I have decided to walk you through a concentration meditation where the focus is on calming the mind and just settling into the present moment. So we will begin with me ringing the meditation bell, and I will give you instructions as we go through this. So to begin, please just adjust your posture so that you feel comfortable and still alert. You're welcome to keep your eyes open or closed. And just take a few deep breaths and allow yourself to just settle into your body. Become aware of how your body feels in the sitting position that you've chosen. If you're more comfortable lying down, leaning against a wall, any of that is fine. But do bring your awareness into your body. And begin to notice your breath. Notice it from the point that is most easily available to you. For some people, that may be the nostrils. For other people, the chest, maybe even the back, the abdomen. Just allow your awareness to sink into whatever spot in your body gives you access to the sensation of breathing. Allowing yourself to become aware of the in-breath and the out-breath. And as your mind wanders, just gently, softly, and with kindness, bring your awareness back to that place in your body where it's easiest to pay attention to your breath. As you watch your breath, you may start to notice more subtle aspects of the breath. You may notice a difference in length between one breath and the next. You may notice a pause between the out breath and the next in breath. You may notice some tension or pressure, some sense of trying to control the breath. If that happens, really just take a couple of deep breaths and allow your body to establish its own natural breathing rhythm. Remembering to bring your awareness back to the breath whenever your awareness wanders. It's totally natural that it will wander. Just gently bring it back and be aware of whatever phase of the breath cycle you're in. So allowing it to be as it naturally is. As the breath calms down and the mind calms down, you may be aware of a larger space between the out breath and the next in breath. If that is the case, just allow yourself to be aware of the feeling of your sitting position. And then take the awareness back to the breath. Breathing in, breathing out, sitting, breathing in, and just continuing in that way. Be aware of any tendency to force that to happen. And just try to let go of that tendency. Always coming back to just the natural breath. Just allowing the breath to be as the breath needs to be. Please feel free to take a moment and adjust your position. Make yourself comfortable before I begin the talk this evening. The intention I have in giving this talk tonight is to help us understand that even though the teachings of the last Buddha have been around for more than 2,500 years, they are still incredibly relevant today. And what better topic to pick to explain that and to give examples of that than the pandemic that we are still enduring, and the pandemic that is still very much running our lives. The Buddha's teachings are based only on one thing, and they're based on suffering and the end of suffering. It is the only area in which the Buddha directed his attention. It's the most important thing in the teaching. And it is explained in thousands of different ways, but the bottom line is the only thing the Buddha talked about, the only thing that mattered in the teaching was how to permanently stop suffering. There's a lot of suffering with regard to the pandemic. The ambient stress level is much higher than usual. People are more easily rattled. They get anxious and angry and confused more than usual. It's happening all over the planet. There's a huge amount of suffering that's directly or indirectly related to the pandemic. And the Buddha had quite a bit to say about this suffering. The Four Noble Truths are a summary of the entire teaching. And I'm going to deconstruct that a little bit for you this evening so that we can see some very practical and clear examples that the pandemic has created for us as examples of the Four Noble Truths. And I will talk about how to respond to those in a way that is not increasing our suffering. Many of you might know what the Four Noble Truths are, so I'll go through them very quickly because I want to talk about the three universal characteristics that are the basis of the Four Noble Truths. And from there, talk about examples of how we get caught, all right, in suffering because of our not lack of understanding or our failure to remember these universal characteristics. So the first noble truth says that life is unsatisfactory. And the second noble truth says that life is unsatisfactory basically because of craving or clinging. And what that means on a practical level is the reason that life is unsatisfactory is because we want things to be different than they actually are. And it's that disconnect between the reality and our desire that causes additional distress. So those first two noble truths, life is unsatisfactory, and the cause of the dissatisfaction or distress or the suffering is because we cling and crave. The third and fourth noble truths speak to what happens when we don't do that, when we don't crave, when we don't cling, when we don't want things to be different than they actually are. So the third noble truth speaks to the cessation of suffering. It refers to the idea that it is possible to not suffer. And the fourth noble truth gives us a very specific set of recommendations, 8 recommendations in particular, to follow that will get us to the place where it's possible to let go of the clinging and the craving. So the suffering stops. That fourth noble truth is referred to as the Noble Eightfold Path, and it speaks about right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. In this context, right is not the opposite of wrong. Right refers to skillful or morally appropriate. So that's a lot of information. If you're not familiar with the Four Noble Truths, then it's a very quick summary if you are. Underlying the Four Noble Truths are the 3 universal characteristics, and they are, in English, impermanence, stress, and corelessness. Anicca, dukkha, anatta in Pali. And it is fundamentally our tendency to forget these universal truths that cause us to suffer. Universal truths are phenomena that exist whether you know about them or not. They exist no matter who you are or what you believe, right? It's like gravity. Gravity exists, it just is. You don't have to know about it. You don't have to be in agreement with it. You don't have to sit in a certain position or think of a certain thing or have a certain activity for gravity, all right, to exist. It just exists everywhere on this planet for everyone. And so with the 3 universal characteristics, they exist. All conditioned things are impermanent. Now that's easy to say, and it's pretty easy to get your head around cognitively, but almost all of us fail to live as if that's true. And the pandemic is a huge example of how hard it is for us to accept impermanence. Today, the restaurants are open. Tomorrow, the restaurants are closed. Can 10 people go? No, 20 people can sit at the table. No, only my family can go. No, now I can have another family. And on and on and on. It changes, and you pretty much have to check most days to see what the rules are. And the rules not only change here in Calgary, but they change in different provinces, in different countries. So what I can do in Alberta, I can't do in Nova Scotia, for example. What I can do in Canada, I can't do in the US. What I can do in the US, I can't do in Canada. And it has become very confusing and very aggravating and very stressful. It produces anxiety and irritation and frustration and confusion for people. And the underlying Buddhist principle that drives this is that we treat impermanent things as if they are permanent. We resist the reality that everything is impermanent. We resist the reality that everything is in flux. The pandemic has made it incredibly difficult for us to ignore this fact. Things are continuously changing, much faster than most of us in the West would experience it without a pandemic. We get used to our habit patterns, we get used to our routines, right? We think we can count on them, we think that they're going to stay the same, it's not going to be a problem. And the pandemic has thrown everything up in the air. And it isn't being, that impermanence isn't being met, all right, with ease and grace by most of us. It's been very, very hard on people. And it's been hard because of our failure to understand that everything is impermanent. Now, nobody's doing anything wrong. It's not that you shouldn't be upset about these things. This is simply the reality. It's simply an example of what the Buddha talked about, that we treat impermanent things as if they're permanent. And then when the impermanence hits us in the face, it's very painful and it's very scary. So that's the first universal characteristic. The second universal characteristic is the fact that there is stress, that we suffer. The word in Pali is dukkha, and dukkha is a very difficult word to translate. It means many things. It could be a tiny irritation. There's a noise in the background, it's kind of bothering you when you're trying to read something, all the way up to horrendous destruction, devastation. So it covers a very broad range of suffering or unsatisfactoriness. It does, however, according to the Four Noble Truths, have a very specific cause. And so we must separate what Buddhism means by dukkha from what I'm going to call pain. Losing your home, not being able to pay the rent, not having a job to go to, being trapped in the house for days, weeks on end, the young children and pets, and you can't go out and do what you normally do. Those things aren't pleasant. And it's really important that you understand that Buddhism is not saying they're supposed to be pleasant. But Buddhism is saying that we react to those things in a way that makes everything worse. We get caught in wanting them to be different. We fail to just accept the reality. So in the meditation that we just did, I talked a little bit about just allowing the breath to be there, just allowing it to be the way it is. Don't try to control it. Don't try to make it different than it is. Just allow it to be there. And that's what we mean by acceptance. It's not that we like something. It's not that we think it's a good thing or a better thing than other people have. There's no judgment at all. We're just not fighting it. We're letting go of any resistance we have to what is actually happening. There's quite a few things with regard to the pandemic that are actually happening, right? The latest variant is running rampant in various parts of the world. It's almost doubled in Alberta in the last 24 hours. I know it's in part because of how they're doing the testing, but nonetheless, it's increased significantly. But in other parts of the world, all right, people are restricting, other countries are restricting who can enter because, neighboring countries have so much Omicron variant cases. That's just happened. 10 days before Christmas, that's just happening. 20 days before Christmas, this wasn't a big deal. Nobody seemed too concerned about it, or at least it hadn't hit the popular press yet. And so the tendency is to go, why now? I am so tired of this. It just needs to be over. I don't want to follow the rules anymore. And the mind goes and goes, and we get caught in either some kind of greedy, grasping thoughts, or in some angry, aversive thoughts where we just want to push things away. So whether we're holding on to the nice things or we're pushing the unpleasant things away, it doesn't matter, right? Both of those represent a failure to just accept things the way they are. And both of those things, wanting things to be different than they are, add to our suffering. They are the cause of our suffering, as I defined it according to the Buddhist teachings. So every time we can meet the ever-changing situation with regard to the pandemic with just accepting this is what's happening, we don't have to like it, you don't have to agree with it, but we just stop fighting it. It allows us to take a deep breath. It allows us to think clearly. It allows us to respond to this situation with a sense of wisdom, skillfulness. It allows us to respond in a way that doesn't increase our own suffering. It doesn't make us more miserable. When we don't do that, when we want things to be different than they are, and we get annoyed or frustrated or scared, how do we feel inside? We feel tense, we feel stressed, we feel unhappy and worried, and we are unintentionally, but nonetheless, making the situation worse for ourselves. So this is the second universal characteristic. Conditioned things are unsatisfactory. They can never permanently make us happy. Now, in part, that's because they're impermanent, and in part because we're clinging, or we're wanting them to be different. We're wanting to hold on to 2 weeks ago when I could do anything I wanted, pretty much. And we're wanting to push away the things we don't like. We do this absolutely instinctively. We don't think about it. It's totally automatic. Another aspect of this, of the universal characteristic of dukkha, is that we take unpleasant things to be pleasant. We think that external things are going to make us happy. We've all fallen into this. Just think about the last time you bought something that you liked, new clothes, a new vehicle, right? Went on a vacation. I'm not saying that you didn't enjoy that. I'm not saying that the new object wasn't pleasant, but it didn't make you permanently happy. That's not the way it works. It just doesn't. Okay, it gives us some enjoyment, some pleasure, and that's fine. But this sense, deep sense that we have that external things are going to make us happy for a long, long time, right, is always disappointing. The first scratch on the car. I remember not long ago, I had a new vehicle, and I didn't have it for even a week, and I'm driving home at night on a highway, and a truck passes me going in the opposite direction, and a great big rock shatters my windshield. Well, this mind wasn't very happy about that, right? I didn't want that to happen. It was brand new. But this is the nature. Everything is impermanent. Things that I don't like happen, right? And if I get stressed and annoyed and upset about that, I'm making myself even less happy. So this tendency to think that life will go back to the way it was, the belief that if they just took the restrictions away, or if they just made sure that we all had our booster shots, or that we made everybody get vaccinated, or whatever it is we think is going to solve the problem, we think that once that's done, everything's going to be fine, but it's not. Because everything's impermanent. Because of the tendency to want things to be a certain way, want them to be different than they are. Just because of the tendency that we get bored and disinterested in things after a certain period of time. So we contribute to, all right, we contribute to the struggle that happens and that causes us to suffer. And at the same time, we're creating the problem in the sense that we're not going to stay satisfied with the same thing for very long. We don't have very good attention spans. Right? How long does your favorite food taste good? How many bites of your favorite food do you take before your taste buds habituate, before you get bored with it? It's not very many bites. And if you're not sure about that, I really encourage you to check it out with your favorite food, because you'll see, all right, that we're just wired not to be able to sort of rest in that place. So we take unpleasant things to be pleasant. We think that the unpleasant thing is pleasant, and we think that the thing we think is pleasant is just going to keep us happy forever. And of course, that doesn't happen. And the third universal truth is corelessness, or anatta, translated literally as no self or not self. But I'm going to talk about it this evening in a broader sense. I'm just going to talk about it as that tendency to personalize everything. So impersonal things are taken as personal. Somebody else speaks to me, they're in a bad mood, they're having a bad day, something happened, and they speak to me and I take it personally. I feel like they've insulted me. And how dare they do that? Or what's wrong with me that they can't be nice to me or something. But I personalize things. You personalize things. We all do it, right? That's part of what it is to have an ego, not in the Freudian sense, but just in the everyday sense, right? That we think of ourselves as separate from other people, and we take everything personally. And when we do that, we increase our suffering. So when it's my job that's lost, when it's my community that's in quarantine, the suffering is increased even more. And of course, it's my opinion that's right. And it's my view about masking that's the right view. So therefore, if you have a different view, you must have the wrong view. And as it's very, very obvious in this province, in this country, and pretty much on this planet, it's very obvious how that personalization during the pandemic has caused huge rifts between friends, between family members, communities, countries. It's a very serious problem. Because in that tendency to take things personally, we lose the ability to remember that other people see things differently. Other people's circumstances are different. They value different things. They have different priorities. We start to think that's wrong because what I think has to be right. So there are many examples of that, the anti-masking groups, right, versus the people who think that we should be wearing masks everywhere, the anti-vax groups versus the people who think everybody should be vaccinated, and if you're not vaccinated, you shouldn't be allowed to leave your house, etc., etc. It has polarized the planet, and it's causing more and more stress, more and more suffering. It's moving us farther and farther away from the ability to respond to situations and is increasing the tendency to become reactive. When we're reactive, we're definitely caught in thinking that impermanent things are permanent, unpleasant things are pleasant, and neutral things are personal, or basically everything is personal. The more that we are able to remember that things are impermanent, that many things are unpleasant, and the exact details of that will vary from person to person, but for all of us, there are things that we would consider to be unpleasant. And impersonal things are impersonal things. The more we can remember that, the less reactive we'll be. It doesn't mean that this isn't awful. It doesn't mean that the pandemic isn't hard. It doesn't mean that it isn't a struggle. But it does mean you're not adding additional dukkha. You're not adding more suffering by getting caught in the reactive loop of judging yourself and other people, of becoming polarized and rigid in your thinking. It has to be this way, and this way is my way. That's an example. What I mean by polarized thinking. When we become reactive, we lose the ability to listen to our heart. We lose the ability to be kind, to be gentle, to be generous. I mean, we may go through the motions. It's Christmas season and there's lots of charities that need help, and we may still help those charities. But the quality of generosity, the generosity of spirit that comes from the heart, can't be there if we're caught in reactivity. So those are the ways that I see the Buddhist teaching playing out during the pandemic. But that's only half of the story, because the only thing the Buddha taught was suffering and its end. And so it's important that we look at that side as well. What do we need to do to protect ourselves from adding to the suffering related to the pandemic? Well, there are some very practical things. We need to find ways to respond appropriately to the current situation and not just fly off the handle in reactivity. So taking a little bit of time to meditate every day is very helpful. I chose to do a concentration meditation with you this evening because it does calm the mind down. And when we're highly reactive, we desperately need to calm our minds down. When we're walking around in our daily life, it's incredibly useful to be mindful. But given the very high stress level these days, I would really recommend that you find some time, and if you know how to do concentration meditation, to do some concentration meditation every day. If you don't know how to do that, there's all kinds of teachers around. Leslie mentioned videos, guided meditations they have on their website. There's similar things on my website. There's lots of ways to access that information without too much difficulty at all. Because the calmer the mind is, the more resilience you'll have psychologically. The more you'll be able to respond to the situation and do whatever is skillful, given the current, regulations, given the current COVID case numbers, the hospitalization numbers, etc. The backlog to get vaccines or boosters. So one thing is to make the effort, right, to practice a little bit of concentration meditation on a daily basis. It does add up. It does help. Another thing that's very helpful is to practice some self-compassion. This is hard. It's very hard. Even if you think you're doing really well at it, even if you think you've managed extremely well, and I hope that's true for all of you, but it's still really hard. And so be kind to yourself. Cut yourself some slack. When you realize you've become reactive, you've lost, momentarily the ability to just be responsive, be kind to yourself. Just recognize, right, that you're okay. Do who got you. But just come back to the present moment and start again. The more time that we spend in the present moment, so the more time that we're mindful, right? The more time we're not caught in reactivity. And when we're mindful, we are not caught in the misunderstanding of the universal truths. When we're in the present moment, when we are truly in the present moment, there is no dukkha, there is no suffering. There's no wanting things to be different. Things just are as they are. And so, to the extent that we're capable of being mindful, it's an instant fix for reactivity. Just come back to the present moment. Keep coming back to the present moment over and over and over again. And it will protect you from the reactivity. The mistake that we all make is that we think that it's okay to sit around and pay attention to all those negative thoughts and just watch them. All those reactive thoughts and just watch them. But the reality is it's not easy to do that. We'll get caught up in them most of the time. If you truly could just sit there and watch those thoughts go by and not believe them, not make them personal, that would be totally fine. They wouldn't be a problem. But it's really hard to do that. Our tendency is to believe our thoughts. That's the way we make them personal. And when we do that, we're back in the reactive mode. Taking impersonal things, making them personal. Other things that are very, very helpful to protect us from being reactive or to help us get out of the reactive mode are all of the Brahma Viharas: loving kindness meditation, reflections on joy, cultivating even-mindedness or equanimity, engaging. So those are the 4 Brahma Viharas: loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, equanimity, 4 Brahma Viharas. But also there are aspects of the Brahma Viharas that we can speak about separately from the Brahma Viharas. So generosity, acts of generosity, feeling grateful, paying attention to what we're grateful for. These are extremely helpful. And we can absolutely, without question, train our minds, right, to think this way. We can make a conscious effort to take a few minutes every day and just think about, okay, what am I grateful? What am I grateful for today? And really honestly pay attention to that. Reflect on ways that we were generous to ourselves or other people, or that other people were generous to us. Generosity isn't about giving things away. Generosity, in a spiritual sense, is about having a kind of expanded heart center where there's space for everybody, where there's no judgment, where other people get to be who they are. And that's not always skillful and it's not always wise, but it is who they are. And it's not up to you or to me to judge that. I may make choices about whether I want to be around somebody or not, but to decide that they're the bad person, that's not up to me. So generosity of spirit is the ability to not do that. It's the ability to see things on their own terms. And then to make wise decisions about what you want to do next. It's never about tolerating things that are unskillful, but it is about not judging. Sometimes it's really helpful to also just be very aware of what your body's doing. In the Buddhist teaching, a very important aspect of mindfulness practice is called the Satipatthana Sutta, the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And it very clearly says it in that sutta that in daily life, being mindful of our body is the best way to go, because our body's always doing something. So if we can be mindful of that, of what's happening in the body, then we are in the present moment. Mindfulness is always non-judgmental awareness. So that's another place to start. That's another way to bring ourselves back to the present, to be able to hold on, right, to the non-judgmental awareness. It will flit away. That's not a problem. It's not a problem that your mind wanders. As soon as you know that it's wandering, it's come back to the present moment. The more you practice that, the easier it is, the faster you start to recognize it's moved away. And that's all it takes. So the pandemic is ongoing. We don't know what's going to happen. I think we're 9 days away from Christmas now. We don't really know what's going to happen. We know that in this province, the rules have been loosened up a bit just earlier this week. We also know that, as I said earlier in my talk, that some countries are not letting other people from other countries in because the number of Omicron variant cases is so high in the country. So lots of things could happen. Borders could get closed more. There could be more restrictions. And there's just going to be the overall anxiety around the impermanence, around the uncertainty, around the wanting things to be different than they are. That will escalate because of the new variant, but that will also be there just because we're a long way away from things going back to whatever you think normal is. In fact, they're not going to go back to what you think normal is or what I think normal is. We're going to end up creating a new normal. And since we don't know what that is, it's going to produce uncertainty and anxiety and resistance. But if you remember the 3 universal characteristics, and if you just allow yourself to take a little bit of time and say, oh, right, here's another example of impermanence. And oh, I don't like this. And pay attention to how it feels inside when these universal characteristics present themselves to you. Don't run away from that feeling. Just allow yourself to bear witness to it. That will protect you from becoming reactive. That will create the space that you need to learn to respond to whatever the circumstances. We do need to respond to the circumstances. There are things that are happening that are not skillful, that are not okay. And the Buddha never implied or said that we should just not deal with those things. Never. Always the teaching is to lean into the suffering, to pay attention to it, but to pay attention to it skillfully, not from a place of reaction, but from a place of clarity and calmness, from a place of kindness. Kindness in the sense that we're remembering that we're all suffering. It may look very different. My suffering and your suffering may be miles apart in terms of how they manifest, but we are all suffering. This is hard on everybody. One of the things that is important, I think, to understand about the Buddhist teaching is it's not about willpower. It's not about making ourselves do something. All of the teaching is based on the understanding that when we see things as they really are, there will just organically be a change in perception, a change in belief. When we are able and willing to look at how we create our stress and our suffering, and not just blame that on somebody else or on the pandemic, but see what's happening inside of us that makes it worse. When we see that clearly, it just of its own accord starts to dissipate. That tendency gets weaker and weaker and eventually stops. Not because you've made it stop, but just because the insight, the knowing of it, changes the reality. So it's important not to get caught in that place where you are judging yourself in terms of, if you are a meditator, if you are trying to study Buddhist philosophy, not to judge yourself in terms of how much you know or how good you do various things, or how well you sit, or how long you can meditate for. Those things aren't helpful. Those are making impersonal things personal. Right? That's another one of the three universal characteristics that causes suffering. What helps is just to accept things the way they are, to let go of the judgments, and just to allow things to unfold. It's so easy for me to say that, and it's so incredibly difficult to do it. Everyone, to some degree, right, has a tendency to want things to be a certain way. We have a tendency to want to control things. Some of you may have noticed that just in the meditation tonight, where you were trying to control your breath. Maybe you were trying to slow it down. Maybe you were trying to speed it up, but you were trying to control it somehow. It's very, very common for all of us. I've been meditating a very long time. And I still have times where I notice that, all right, there's tension when I'm watching my breath, that I'm in some way, there's a little bit of trying to control it going on. When that happens, if you can just acknowledge, oh, that's me taking something personal, it's not personal. It's just body breathing. I'm thinking I'm doing something. I'm thinking I'm in charge, or that I'm supposed to be in charge. Even that kind of reflection is incredibly useful. It takes away the rigidity, it loosens up things, it loosens up the thinking. And it starts to open the door to be able to truly see these three universal characteristics in our everyday life, pandemic or no pandemic. But in terms of understanding the Buddhist teachings, the pandemic has been giving us, and continues to give us, a lot of opportunity to really understand what the Buddha was telling us.
And I just wanted to let you know that it's 7:56.
Okay, thank you. So just to summarize, I'm just going to remind you of some of the things that are helpful to move from reactivity, right, to responding. And when we do that, we're more in line with the three universal characteristics. So concentration, meditation practice a little bit every day, mindfulness, not just in your meditation, but mindfulness in your daily life. If that's a new idea for you, just pick one thing or one time of day, 5 minutes somewhere, and just try to do whatever you would normally do in that time with as much awareness as you possibly can. Thoughts of generosity, acts of generosity, recalling having a memory of a time when you were able to be generous, or a time when someone else was generous to you. Paying attention to things that you can be grateful for. Practicing guided loving kindness or compassion, especially self-compassion meditations, meditations on joy, meditations on even-mindedness or equanimity, just that sense of cultivating a mind that isn't totally like a ping pong ball bouncing back and forth depending on what's happening outside, that it can just be steady and still despite the external conditions. So any of these, right, are very useful in bringing us into a place of stillness, a place of responding to the pandemic, to the frustrations, the demands imposed on us because of the pandemic, and protect us from that reactivity that really does add, significantly add, right, to our own suffering. So thank you. I'll turn it over to you now, Leslie.
Unmute. Thank you very much. It was very helpful, especially in the context that you brought it into of our ongoing pandemic. And while we're waiting for some questions from our participants, I'm wondering what you would say to somebody who finds that they have a strong viewpoint and it's in conflict with someone they care about, but they have to have an agreement in order to coexist. So in the same space. So can you make a comment on that?
Yes, unfortunately, that's becoming a rather common dilemma these days. And it's not easy. Part of that dilemma is because we stay focused on the opinion that we have, right? We're clinging, we're attached to that opinion. We're believing it's the right opinion. And when we do that, we're not able to look inside and to pay attention to how it feels to have that discord with the other person who's got another opinion who we have to live with. When we start to be able to look inside, we have the opportunity potentially to see how unpleasant it feels inside of us, right? When I'm attached to an opinion and it's causing distress in my relationship with someone else, I'm focused on trying to convince the other person that my opinion is a better opinion. That's just human nature. But if I turn my attention into how does it feel to have this discord, all right, it gives me the opportunity to start to think about a couple of things. One, what's most important, right? My opinion or dealing with the discord. And also, it gives me the opportunity to see how I am making my own situation more problematic. If I can do that, if any of us can do that, and if I can do it, anybody could do it. So it opens the door to find a compromise. And that's as good as it gets these days, right? Is a compromise. So there are many things I could say about this from a psychological perspective, but I'm here to speak tonight as a Dhamma teacher. And so from that perspective, it's always going to be about looking inside and seeing how I'm suffering by holding on to the opinion that I'm holding on to.
Thank you. So we have a question from one of our participants. It says, building dedication to constant practice seems one of the big walls of resistance. Any idea how I can be more attracted to being driven to daily self-care?
When I listen to the question, what I am resonating with is a sense of trying too hard. I'm going to answer it from that platform, from that space in my mind. And please, if I'm off base, ask the question a different way. But it's a common thing that we push ourselves, right? That we set up expectations about, I'm supposed to do this, I'm supposed to do that, or I've succeeded only if I sit for 20 minutes, 5 days a week, or whatever the storyline is that we create. And what I really recommend is to just try, first of all, make sure you know what the storyline is. Make sure you know what story you have, what narrative you've created that's driving you, and then let it go. Just let it go. And start to allow your actual lived experience to be what creates the expectation. So maybe it's a really busy day. Maybe you remember for 2 minutes to be mindful. Okay, that's what happened. That's what it is. Maybe tomorrow you'll remember to be mindful for 3 minutes. But if you set the expectation that I'm going to be mindful all day long, it just doesn't work that way. The paradox is when we set those kinds of expectations, we're just caught in that taking impersonal things and making them personal. I'm going to make myself. Well, I guarantee you that's not going to work, right? This is one of the complicated and fascinating things, all right, about this philosophy is the more I let go of me doing something, right, the easier this gets. So I would just recommend that you just allow the practice to grow, however it's going to grow. It's okay to remind yourself that you'd like to be practicing more, but don't set rigid things. Don't set rigid guidelines. Right? Just allow it, and to be kind to yourself. It can only grow if we give it the space to grow. If we start to know what to do and push, right, choking it to death, then it just doesn't work. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay, and we have another question. Can you talk some more about sustaining these calm states?
I'm sorry, can I talk more about staying in the
sustaining calm states?
Yeah, that's tricky. It's one thing to get the mind to calm down for a minute. It's another thing to keep it that way. I'm going to say something very similar. Don't worry about it if it doesn't stay calm. All right. Couple of things that are helpful. Once you have had an experience of your mind being calm, even for a second, try to think about now I'm talking about if you're in meditation. So if you're in meditation and your mind is calm for even a second, once the calmness goes away, reflect on what did I do to get my mind to be calm? What did I do? And then you're going to start to use that as your strategy, right? To see if the mind can calm down for another second. And sometimes it will, and sometimes it won't. So to sustain calmness is really to just make sure that the moments or the drops of stillness keep coming, right? That's how we sustain it. Every moment is different. So number one, just reflect on what did I do? Well, when I reflect on what did I do, right, that allowed my mind to calm down, one thing is I will have stopped doing something. Maybe I'll have stopped thinking, or I'll have stopped judging, or I'll have stopped checking in to see if in fact I've stopped doing those things. Like I somehow just allow things to be the way they are. But everybody has to figure that out for themselves. And so that's the first thing I can say about that. The second thing is there's certain patterns of thinking that are particularly problematic. They are definitely obstacles to calming the mind. In the Theravada school, we refer to them as the hindrances. So there are 5 very large categories of mind states or mind qualities that make it difficult for the mind to calm down. And there are specific kinds of antidotes for those. One that's very useful for almost everything is to practice loving kindness meditation. So if you are struggling, your mind is really busy, it's agitated, it's restless, it's annoyed, or it's greedy, right? It might be just wise to listen to a guided loving kindness meditation and allow the mind to calm down a bit, and then just try again to see if you can stay calm at the end of that. This whole practice, certainly in the Theravada school, is one of practice. That word is used quite intentionally, that we practice over and over again. And all those moments of practice do come together. There is a cumulative effect, even though we may not be conscious of it as it's happening. So the most important thing is not to get upset with yourself when the calmness goes away, because everything is impermanent. And so if you're grasping at trying to hold on to the calmness, you're trying to make permanent something that is naturally impermanent. And the more you can just accept that, the easier it will be to come back to the calmness.
Thank you. So the next question. I have spent years ignoring my own opinions to keep other people happy. This has caused a lot of suffering. Would it then be because I cannot let go of my opinions? Is there a way to stand your ground without taking it personally?
That's a very good question, and it's a very complicated question. So I'm going to start with the end of the question is there a way to stand your ground without taking it personally? And the answer to that is yes. So from a psychological perspective, if we believe that we have the right to the opinion we have, and if we can let go of the need for other people to have the same opinion, then it's absolutely possible, right, to stand our ground without taking somebody else's disagreement personally. From a spiritual point of view, however the other person reacts, and I use the word react intentionally, it's about their own relationship with the 3 universal characteristics. It's about their own suffering. It's about their need to be right. It's about taking impersonal things as personal, right? And it's about their own dukkha. And if we can remember that, then there's nothing personal about their reaction. In fact, it makes it easier to have compassion for their reaction because we can see that they're stuck somewhere. So I know that's a very quick answer to a very complicated and long question, but I hope it's helpful.
Going backwards on that, she was seemed, I don't know if it's a she or a he, but that this person seemed to be struggling with, was she causing herself any suffering by holding opinions?
The Buddha said that there's 64 different types of opinions and they're all wrong. And that's never a popular thing for me to say. Nobody likes to hear that. But what the Buddha meant was that they're just opinions and they're based on this belief that there's an individual self. There's a person, right, that has an opinion that needs to be important. And in the universal characteristics, that's not the way it is. There's no separateness. There's just the process of being, and that we're all interconnected. And so it's really hard to address this on a practical level, because in our daily life, we need to have opinions. We need to make decisions. We need to, right, to function. I have all kinds of opinions. I make many, many decisions every day. And I'm okay with that. The difference is how attached I am to them, how attached I am to the outcome. That's where the suffering comes in. And that's where we inadvertently, accidentally cause our own suffering, right? So if it's really important to me that you agree with me, I'm probably set myself up for suffering, right? If I already know we don't have, we don't see the world the same way. But that isn't, if I can have a strong opinion about something and I know that's the right thing for me, and if you agree or don't agree, that's up to you, then I'm not causing myself suffering. So it's the attachment and the need to have other people feel the same way or agree with us, all right, that produces the suffering, not the actual opinion.
Okay, thank you. I have another question for you. What could happen in this situation if it is not only the opinions, but also the person acts in certain ways because of the opinions? So maybe we don't agree with their behavior. I would be thinking that question is referring to.
Okay, so I think whether the disagreement is because of a thought, because of speech, or because of behavior, action, I would say the same thing. Okay, so I'm gonna make up a story, and I'm gonna hope that it fits the question. Okay, so let's say that I believe it's important to wear. I believe that wearing masks in public places is a helpful thing to do, right? I believe it helps protect other people, and to some degree it protects me, and it goes along with what public health says we're supposed to do, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm in the grocery store, and I see not just a customer in the grocery store, but somebody who works there with their mask below their nose, which I understand is not helpful, because it's not, all right, stopping airborne particles from spreading in the air. So if that sort of fits the scenario for the person who's asking the question, from a spiritual point of view, it's all about how do I deal with my reactivity, right? I'm not, trust me, there's a reaction, right? There's a reaction in me when I see that. If I can just use my mindfulness to pause and allow the reaction to dissipate inside me without behaving in any way at all other than pausing, I can then think about what's the most appropriate. What's a skillful way to handle this? So again, and I know I'm repeating myself, I understand that, but it's so critical to remember to look inside and not to stay at that person isn't playing by the rules, or how can the store hire somebody who can't even wear their mask properly, or I'm never shopping here again, and I'm telling everybody I know not to shop here again. If we can let go of all that external part and see how it feels inside, we can come back to a place where we can handle the situation skillfully. I mean, maybe that means we go to customer service and say, look, I think you need to know this, that, staff personnel X, right? But that's doing, if that's what you feel like you need to do, then okay, but you're doing it in a way that isn't cruel or hurtful. It isn't insulting. It isn't shaming, right? You're just providing feedback to the store. That's a skillful thing to do that, I think, in certain contexts. So I'm sorry. I hope that helps to answer the question. All right.
Okay, thank you. We do have more questions, so I'll keep going. When learning to embrace the practice and the teachings of the Buddha, specifically regarding the non-abiding self, it seems difficult to continue existing relationships with others that are not on the same path. Do you have any suggestions or comments surrounding this?
Yeah, I do. I have quite a few. These universal truths are universal truths. Okay, gravity exists whether I know about it or not. These three universal characteristics exist whether the person that you're referring to knows about them or not. It's not our place to make that judgment. So every time we do that, what we're actually doing, although no, I don't think anybody does this intentionally, we're actually increasing our sense of self. We're actually making things more personal than they need to be. Right? So if I talk about gravity, it might seem, it might be helpful, it might make more sense, right? Like if you live with somebody who doesn't believe gravity exists, well, okay, the next time something leaves their hands unexpectedly, it's going to fall to the floor, whether they think that's going to happen or not, right? That's just what's going to happen. I don't need to have an argument about that. I don't need to kind of try to convince them about that. It's just is what it is. And so if we can hold that kind of space about our own spiritual practice, all right, then it frees us up so that it doesn't produce conflict with the other person. That's one piece of it. The other piece of it is if we're in a situation with somebody who, is on a different spiritual path or not on a spiritual path, as far as we know, and their behavior is really unskillful, so that they're causing harm to themselves or someone else, it's very important to understand that this is what it means to be human. This is how we get stuck. And the most skillful thing to do is to be able to have compassion for that, to just recognize that the person doesn't understand how they're making their life harder. Now, there are certain things in life that could be called dangerous, and we need to make sure that we keep ourselves safe. I mean, I'm not saying stand there and allow yourself to be abused ever. Buddha would never say that. It's not okay. But you don't have to abuse the other person. You just have to get yourself safe. So it's always trying to understand it. It's trying to understand everything from this frame of reference of the universal characteristics. Right? When people sound like they're angry at me, they're just caught up at something. They're angry at me. They think I've done something wrong, right? They're blaming me for something. But if I can remember that they're blaming me because they're not paying attention to how they feel inside, they're not paying attention to how aversion has risen in their own mind, then that's where they're stuck. That doesn't have to have anything to do with me. Now, sometimes I do things that I shouldn't have done them, and I need to apologize for that. It's not abdicating my responsibility, but I think we're talking about a situation where the negativity that's being directed towards the person isn't appropriate, like it isn't warranted, right? So,
Thank you. We have another question. We resist everything because our sense of self does not like what is happening. We then identify and own ourself. How do we see that our self is impermanent and conditionally created and non-attached?
boy, when you figure that out, please let me know. Okay, this is the hard, most difficult part. And to be honest with you, lots of people in the West don't really emphasize this part of the teaching, but I think it's incredibly important and causes a great deal of suffering. There are all kinds of moments in everyday life where the illusion of self isn't present. We often talk about it as being in the zone, right? When the thing we're doing and ourself are not separate. So I don't downhill ski, so this example, I may not be able to capture it well. But if you do ski, downhill ski, there'll be those moments where there's just skiing that's happening, right? There isn't me skiing, right? And in those moments where there's just skiing happening, the skiing is going better than when I'm skiing, right? I ride horses, so this I know well, all right? When there's just riding happening, it is a beautiful thing. And that's all that's happening. There's no thinking going on. There's no judging going on. When I'm writing, there's a disconnect between the activity and me. And when that disconnect is there, I am selfing. There is selfing happening. So all of those moments, as rare as they might be, when the activity is just there, right? And there's no separation between the person and the activity, those are moments of non-selfing. So to the extent that you have ever had one of those moments, you can recall it, you can remember it, all right? You can understand it and become better equipped or more mindful in recognizing those moments when they happen. Right? because everything is impermanent, because everything is rising and falling away, it's useful to remember that life is a process, not an object, and that process is continuously changing. So there is no permanent self. There's just moments changing, every moment changing, changing, changing. That's what deep levels of impermanence really mean. It doesn't mean that my car breaks down or the grocery stores out of the kind of butter I like, all right? Those are impermanent things too, but on a deeper level, it's the continuous flux, the continuous change. So there is nowhere for a permanent self. So self arises, the illusion of self rises and falls away, rises and falls away, rises and falls away. So if we can be more conscious of the moments when it's fallen away, we come to a different kind of understanding about what self means, right? There are informal meditation, many particular insights that are relevant to weakening the belief in a personal self, but on an everyday practical level, we can just think about those moments of being in the zone, right, as moments where there is no self. And that's an excellent place to start.
Okay. Do you have any closing remarks you want to make for us as we move forward through the holiday season and dealing with the pandemic?
I think first and foremost, I really want to emphasize that my intention here is to help people find ways to manage difficult situations, to bring to life the Buddhist teachings in the 21st century, to find ways to help people understand that these teachings are still incredibly relevant, important, and useful. And to be kind to yourself. This is the hardest thing I have ever done, right? Is to practice this. And it's also the most useful and amazing thing I've ever done. But it isn't easy. It hasn't been easy. It takes determination. It takes effort. And it takes the ability to not push. How do you put all that together in the West? Because they don't go together in the West, right? How do you just let yourself drop into these meditative states without pushing and say that they're really hard at the same time? Well, that's one of the great paradoxes. So be kind to yourself. Every moment you're not kind to yourself, you're selfing. You're blaming yourself for something, all right? You're taking it personally when it's not personal. And so that is the message that I hope that, the two messages that I hope you can take away from tonight and that you can carry into the holiday season. So that the holiday season is peaceful and has a sense of ease and grace and lightness to it, rather than, that heavy burden of having to get it right and being too busy and too stressed and not getting enough sleep, etc., etc.
Okay.
So I wish for all of you a very joyful and peaceful and content holiday season.
We have thank yous rolling in for you, Anne, for your talk. Many people have found it helpful and appreciate it. So I have a few closing remarks on behalf of WTM. If you'd like to stay in touch with us, we do have an opportunity for you to sign up to receive notifications through our website, a newsletter, and there are links to register for future events. Also, you can register for events on the Calgary Public Library site through typing in mindfulness. These events are freely offered. It's a nonprofit, volunteer-led organization. We don't have any costs for the speakers, but we do have costs for managing the website and sending out for our basically technical support for social media, emails, etc. And we do appreciate donations, and you can do that on our website. For example, a donation of $5 is very helpful for allowing us to continue to provide these talks to you. Now, we are hopeful that someday we will be returning to in-person meetings, but at this time we're continuing with online meetings, virtual meetings. And we are very grateful to Anne Mahoney for joining us twice in the last month and providing her wisdom and her kindness to support our ongoing practice of meditation. And also thank you to Maya for her support this evening, very skillful and consistent support for these meetings. And also to Phil Bluestein and other members of our organizing committee for providing the background efforts that are needed to make these events happen. And we look forward to seeing you again on January 6th if you're able to come. So good evening.